Dostoevsky, The Formation of a Man. Today I'm going to talk to you about an article I recently wrote, and it's on Dostoevsky, the writer, who you probably know. Now, this is not going to be the typical video where you get an analysis of Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, or the Brothers Karamazov, but rather I want to talk to you about the early Dostoevsky. And I've titled the article The Man because that's what I want to focus on. Who was he before the deity of a writer that we know him to be? And it happens that we tend to think of Dostoevsky as a myth, as a mythical figure in literature. And it's true because he was impressive. But it's also partially true because the man himself had to live through so much that enabled him to potentially become what we know him now to be, right? This amazing writer. And so, first and foremost, what Dostoevsky experienced in his life was suffering, pain, and discipline. And don't get me wrong, I want to talk to you about Dostoevsky as a man, not for you to understand his works better, because you can actually read any of his works and get them beautifully. You can get the meaning, you can get the expressions, you can get the story. That's fine. What I want to do is present to you the man so that you know how he could actually write like that. Because without what he lived through, we wouldn't have Dostoevsky at all. So to begin with, he was born in a not poor, not particularly rich family. His father was a doctor, and he was a doctor in a hospital for the poor and the abandoned. And Dostoevsky and the family lived near the grounds of the hospital. So he was in constant exposure to pain and suffering, which never left him. It was like a curse that accompanied Dostoevsky. After the upbringing in his household and being raised by a father who was extremely stiff and disciplined, he was sent to a military academy in St. Petersburg, which was the fashion of the time. There, Dostoevsky studied engineering, and this is not particularly relevant for his writing because, as we know, he's not writing about engineering, but it's relevant because, again, here we see military action. Here we see military discipline. Here we see military values. So Dostoevsky, since he was very young, was trained not to think, but to do. It was not a matter of choice. It was a matter of orders, and he had to follow. Of course, at nights, he would devour any literature he could get. He was reading like crazy, and he was writing like crazy, despite being in a military academy. Something very important that I also want to mention is that Dostoevsky had a brother, and excuse my Russian pronunciation, but it's Mikhail, and often history has given little credit to him, but in fact Dostoevsky owns so much to his brother. He was one of the main reasons Dostoevsky was able to stay afloat, and they actually co-founded a journal that gave a push to Dostoevsky to become famous. Mikhail supports Dostoevsky not only emotionally, but also financially, which was key for Dostoevsky. When Dostoevsky was finishing school, he wrote his first major work. It was called Poor Folk. This was a breakthrough, and this was when Dostoevsky's genius became public. Very quickly, the novel was distributed among the Russian intelligentsia, and he was tagged as the future writer of Russia. He was seen as a genius, and he was seen as, the next Pushkin, if you may. However, fame and youth rarely come well together. There are many examples where it does, but there are many examples where it doesn't. And Dostoevsky is on the latter. He couldn't manage fame. His writing got worse. He was intimidated. His nerves were terrible at the time, and so it was very quick, his ascent to fame, but it was also very quick how he came down from it. He was criticized, and apart from the poor folk, you barely get any good Dostoevsky level writing at all. And after that came something that changed Dostoevsky's life. And arguably, I would say that without that episode, we wouldn't have any Dostoevsky at all. And the reason is because if Dostoevsky had not been through this hardship, there would be no way he could ever endure what life had prepared for him. Dostoevsky suffered so much, but it was in Siberia, when he was sent to the camp in Siberia, when he was imprisoned, that he really learned to endure life and the worst of it. And it is also when he renounced to his egoism and he migrated to be someone, released of all these prior fame and dreams of greatness and stuff. Now he encountered humanity in its worst, and that changed him forever. The man that used to be surrounded by the Russian intelligentsia, the man that was thought of as the next star of Russia, now lived with murderers, rapists, thieves, and he had to make his way through that. He was sleeping in the cold, he was sleeping in the floor, everything was filled with, I don't even want to say it, but you can imagine, it was disgusting. There were no bathrooms, everything was disgusting. The food was terrible. He was in his bones. And so even then he had to go through labor, he had to work. And I can only think that it was truly, truly horrible, the experience. Now, what's interesting is that when he got out of Siberia, he wrote, allegedly, one of his best works, and it's The House of the Dead. And this is basically a recap of what he encountered in this experience. It's not particularly autobiographical, but you can find quite a lot of what was going on in his mind and in his feelings when he was in Siberia. And just to give you a note on this, it's incredible how the Tsar played with Dostoevsky's mind. So because he was involved in these revolutionary groups, the young in that moment were thinking about nihilism, some forms of socialism, and they wanted to maybe change the form of government in Russia. I wouldn't go that far, but anyway, it was some sort of a revolution going on. And Dostoevsky was caught in one of the gatherings of this revolutionary group. He was sentenced to death. And when he was transported to the place where he was going to be shot, they took him and they prepared him. They pointed at him. And just when the soldier was going to pull the trigger, an order came very quickly saying that the Tsar and his almightiness was forgiving the prisoners, and that instead of killing them, he was sending them to Siberia. So that's just a side note, but it's an interesting detail. Another thing that is important to mention about this time of Dostoevsky and how he later became so obsessed and so inspired by Russian personality and by what was going on in Russia is that everyone at the time was focused on that. It's not that Dostoevsky is the only one that writes about, the Russian feeling, the Russian culture. It's that the political, the socio-political phenomenon was going on all over the intelligentsia circle. Tolstoy was thinking about that, Dostoevsky and many others were writing about that. So he's not a pioneer in that way. He's rather more responding to the general literary circles of Russia. But he was indeed interested in the questions of freedom, of revolution, of morality, later religion. And so he was writing constantly about this. However, given the various uprisings of the different groups, some response came from the Tsar and the government, which was censorship. And now you couldn't publish anything. You had to write it, send it to the authorities, to the censorship. The censor would read it, and if it was okay, approve that, and then it could be published. If it wasn't okay, they would change, they would cross out, and they would edit your paper, and then it would go through. So if you wanted to talk about something that was particularly sensible, so that it was risky, what you had to do was dress the idea in a way that the censor wouldn't catch, but that the general public, upon an effort in the reading, would actually get. And that made Dostoevsky's writing to become even better. Because now, well, not only Dostoevsky, same for Tolstoy, now what they are doing is that they're digesting an idea, giving it to you, but not evidently. You have to work your way through the idea, and then you will get there. But it's not going to be at face value. So that's an interesting detail. Why am I telling you this about censorship? Because Dostoevsky by this time had, as I mentioned earlier, co-founded a journal with his brother Mikhail. It was called The Time, and there he was the editor. They asked for many loans to keep it afloat, and surprisingly, it did very well. At the beginning, they had many subscribers, pieces were flowing in from all over Russia. He liked to give some privilege to younger writers. So basically, Dostoevsky was exposed to everything that was being written at that time in Russia. He was reading other literary reviews and newspapers, and he was writing his own. So as you can see, it's not that he was secluded and he suddenly wrote the best novels we have in literature, but rather that he was in constant exposure to words and ideas. Now, at some point, it all went down. It was because of an article that didn't pass censorship. And now Dostoevsky, being an ex-felon, well, not felon, but an ex-convict, there was no chance that the censorship and the authorities would let it go. So they shut down Time, and Dostoevsky had no journal anymore. What he did is that he tried to found another one. Well, sadly, Mikhail died, and now he needed to take care of Mikhail's family, and he was broke, and Mikhail's family were broke, and they all had loans, so it was a terrible financial situation. So what he did in response is try to build back up another journal, and it was called Epoch. Sadly, Epoch did terribly, and it didn't last more than months. But the problem is that Dostoevsky incurred in a massive amount of debt. So at some point, the creditors came collecting, and that led to Dostoevsky eventually needing to run. So he decided to leave at that point because tension was, rising and rising, and he went to explore Europe. He had Europe in his mind for a while, and he wanted to visit France, England, Italy, Germany, and he did. He did. And yet, upon his return, Dostoevsky, and in his letters you can read something like that, he kind of confessed that he found poverty in Europe, but not financial poverty, but moral poverty. He was not impressed at all with Europeans, and he thought that, well, Russians were more interesting, at least for his writings. So he went back, he tried to figure everything out, and then he came up with what would be his next major hit, which was Notes from the Underground. And those two, well, three, Poor Folk, The House of the Dead, and Notes from Underground, were the three major works of Dostoevsky prior to what he became later. I would say that those were the three major works of the post-Siberia period of Dostoevsky. And then later on you get Crime and Punishment, then The Idiot, then Demons, and then the Brothers Karamazov. And I started this by telling you that it is about the man, because in fact, Dostoevsky suffered terrible epileptic attacks. His nervous system was crushed. He was poor. His first wife died. His brother died. He was being chased by creditors. He was banned. He lost not one, but two different journals. He couldn't find love that easily. He proposed to a girl. He was rejected. He was in very poor health. And through all that, he survived. He kept writing. And I think, this is my argument, that it's all because how he was brought up. It's about the father and how he trained Dostoevsky to endure life. It's about how he was exposed to suffering from the very beginning. It's about how Siberia made him unbreakable. And it's about how his mind, after all he went through in the camp, in the prison camp in Siberia, became solid, rock solid. You could not break Dostoevsky down. And don't get me wrong, it's not that he became famous when he published Crime and Punishment or Demons or The Idiot. In fact, as I will talk in a future article, because this is part one of a series, those works, not all of them were received very good. In fact, The Idiot was not actually received well at all. It was thought to be displeasing and not particularly good in regards to its aesthetics and how it was written. But in any case, that's a different theme. What I want to say is that it is because of this hardship that we get, first and foremost, the man that can endure, the man that can write. Then we get the genius and the writer. But first, we have the man. Well, yeah, this is it. I wanted to talk to you about Dostoevsky. And the reason why I wanted to talk to you about Dostoevsky is because we tend to think of him like this god of literature, and as if he was thrown into the world, he wrote major novels, and then he left. Well, no, he was mortal. He suffered. He cried. He broke. But he never gave up. So that's a big lesson, not just for me, but I think for everyone. And not just for us writers, but I think for everyone in life. I hope you enjoy this, and I will bring you next week another article. Turns out it's about someone that was in Dostoevsky's life and that rejected him when he proposed marriage. See you next time.